Remember when Noah is brought safely through the flood waters with his family and with the animals on the ark? And the first thing Noah does is build an altar and offer sacrifices to God. But why is it so important that this is the first thing Noah does in the new world? Why does God respond so extravagantly to Noah's offerings? What is this small section of scripture revealing about God? Let's jump into Genesis 8 verse 21 and 22 to find out. Genesis 8:21 says, "And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart," I'm just going to highlight the heart here in yellow, "I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. While the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease." To summarize Genesis chapter 8 in one statement, God stops the flood waters after 40 days. Noah comes out and offers sacrifices to God. Two words that capture the heart of this chapter would be new world, the new world. We've seen the flood waters be that transition period between the old and the new. If you were to separate this chapter and break it down into sections, verse 1 through 5, God stops the flood waters. Verse 6 through 12, Noah takes action to figure out what's happening outside the ark. Verse 13 through 19, God tells Noah to come out of the ark. And verse 20 through 22, Noah offers sacrifices, and God makes a promise. So as we close this chapter of Genesis, some key words to pay attention for as you go back through and read Genesis 8. Waters, land and ground, mountains, birds, animals, and beasts. Some key ideas to look for is the idea of waiting, stopping the waters, resting or finding a resting place, the waters drying up, entrance into a new world, and offering sacrifices. Some brand new ideas we have not seen in the first 8 chapters of Genesis first 7 until right now. The idea of building an altar, sending out the birds, God shutting the windows of the heavens and the fountains of the deep, looking for rest, offering clean animals as sacrifices, and then seed time, harvest, summer and winter. We've seen the signs for seasons, but we've not seen these seasons explicitly spoken of and talked about in this way. So back to verse 21, when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma of what? Of these burnt offerings that Noah is sacrificing on the altar he built, the clean birds, the clean animals, God responds and says in his heart. Now this is what's interesting. The fact that God, I never actually paused to question this, but the fact that God is saying this in his heart might indicate to us that this is not something Noah heard, at least quite yet at this point in the story. Maybe chapter 9 is when God actually reveals this and makes this known to Noah. Or this involves God in the core essence of who he is, responding in this way to Noah, and then he'll tell Noah what it is that he is saying in his heart. But here God smells a pleasing aroma that moves him to make a promise, which is going to be this blessing upon creation. And I think the idea of a pleasing smell unto God, that's actually something you can see throughout the rest of the Bible. For example, in Exodus and Leviticus, there is fragrant incense that is going to be found within the tabernacle. And that fragrant incense will be burning continually before the Lord. And then there's a certain fragrant smell that comes with the burnt offerings. And then New Testament, you get to Ephesians 5, it tells us that Jesus offered himself as a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God, pleasing to the Father. 2 Corinthians 2 tells us that God actually spreads the fragrance of his Son and the knowledge of his Son through his people. And then we get to verse 20, the rest of verse 21. He says, I will never again curse the ground. This is what I think is really important for us to see. It's not just that God says, I will never again curse the ground in general, but it's specifically this. He won't do it because of man's evil intentions and heart that's there from his youth. So the idea of, in Genesis chapter 27, for example, this is a weird place to go, but in my studies, this is where I found myself. In Genesis 27, there's this idea of a pleasing fragrance that prompts blessing, just like we see here. There's a pleasing aroma, which seems to be the obedience and the sacrifice and the faithfulness of this righteous one, Noah, that God responds to with blessing. We see both of those components in Genesis 27, where we see Isaac smelling the garments of his younger son, Jacob. But it smells like Esau, who has been hunting in a field that God has blessed, and the smell of these garments prompt Jacob to bless his son after he eats a home-cooked meal brought by Jacob, which was really cooked by Rebekah. So we see the idea of a pleasing fragrance in that story, a blessing, and a kind of sacrifice. And you're going, I don't see any sacrifice. Well, there's a meal that came with meat from hunted animal. So an animal had to be killed for that meal to be eaten and enjoyed. We see, and it's offered to Jacob. And we see this idea explored a bit further with the garments being the pleasing fragrance. So this moves us, when we get to the New Testament, this moves us beyond the realm of a physical altar and into the idea of us being clothed in the righteousness of Jesus. And Jesus is that fragrant, pleasing aroma to the Father that covers us and clothes us in his own righteousness and holiness. Also, God seems to liken the flood to cursing the ground, which isn't just to reduce the flood down to that simple idea. I don't want to oversimplify it. But again, it's synonymous with the flood is a curse on the ground. In other words, the flood is to be seen as God cursing the ground, which is what we've seen amplified from Cain and Adam. So go back to Genesis 3, Adam and Eve's sin. Adam's sin caused the ground to be cursed. And then that evolves in Genesis 4 when Cain murders Abel. And that causes Cain to be cursed from the ground. So then we see Genesis 6 and 7. This gets amplified even more. And Genesis 6 through 7 seems to be the escalation of that sin and that cursing. And the sin is amplified exponentially through people that have filled the land with violence and wickedness and murder. And so the curse is amplified with it. And the curse in Genesis 6 and 7, going to be the flood, is that every living thing on the land is cursed and swept away by the floodwaters of death. Either way, the curse involves death each and every time. And God chooses not to curse the ground anymore because of man in the way that he did with the flood. Apparently, it's because of this righteous man, Noah. His pleasing sacrifice was a fragrant aroma to the Lord, and that is part of the reason that God has said this in his heart. Look at the language. When the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, then the Lord said this in his heart. So what God says here and promises to never do again is partly because of what Noah does with the sacrifices. It just gives us an image of Jesus. So an offering is what moved God to make this promise. And we go, why just a simple building an altar and offering animals? Why does that move God to act or to make such an extravagant, gracious decision? Why? What's the connection between Noah and his sacrifice and his righteousness and the ground not being cursed in that way again? These animals actually, we think about where the animals came from. Genesis 1 and 2, the animals came from the ground, came from the dust. Apart from the birds just seem to, there they are. And God fills the sky. And Noah's sacrifice of these animals is what moves God to make a promise that he would never curse the ground because of man, the way that he did with the flood this time around. Verse 21, God says he won't curse the ground because of man. I think this phrase here is what I really want to focus on. Because of man's evil intentions and his heart being evil from his youth. So here's what I want to wrestle with for just a few moments. We will absolutely see the concept of the land or lands being desolate as judgment upon the inhabitants of that land. We'll see that idea throughout Scripture, whether it comes through sword or pestilence or famine or other means by which the land experiences a kind of cursing because of mankind's wickedness. So a question I have is God referring to something entirely different? When he says, I will never again curse the ground, and yet throughout the biblical story, we're going to see a kind of judgment that comes upon the land because of humanity's wickedness, and the ground in that sense experiences a kind of cursing. If we're going to see that, then what exactly is God referring to here? Does he mean that he won't specifically curse the ground the way he did with the floodwaters? Because God doesn't say, here's what God does say rather. God says, I will never strike down every living creature as I have done. Neither will I ever strike down every living creature as I have done. And this right here, the striking down of every living creature is related to the ground being cursed. So when God says that, it seems to refer to the way that God ended the lives of his creatures on the land. God says the ground won't be cursed because of mankind. It won't be caused by mankind's wickedness anymore. So what would qualify the ground being cursed again then? Is God essentially saying that I won't curse the ground because of man, but does that leave an open door for the land to be cursed in a different way because of different reasons? Just questions that I have because of the way I see the biblical story unfold. Does this kind of hint at the idea that the ground was somewhat unfairly treated because of evil, man's evil and sin? Because again, the ground didn't directly commit any kind of moral evil. The ground didn't earn a curse for itself by its own works. Rather, the ground is cursed because of Adam, or in Genesis 4 because of Cain, or in Genesis 6 because of mankind filling the land with violence and bloodshed and the blood that would soak into that ground. Also, the idea of the intention of man's heart being evil from his youth. For the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I ever again strike down every living creature as I have done. If you go to Genesis 6, the language is a little different. God saw that the intentions of man were continually evil. So this story, Genesis 6 through 8, tells us that, yeah, mankind's heart is evil from his youth, which brings us back to the beginning of chapter 6 when God saw the wickedness of man was great. And those wicked hearts are part of the reason that God will never curse the land again in the way he did with the floodwaters. So I want us to see this almost reversal. In Genesis 6, God brings the floodwaters because of mankind's wickedness, because he sees that the intent and desire of mankind's heart is only evil continually. But then in Genesis 8, at the end of this story, we see God working with that same data. Mankind's heart is evil, but it prompts him to do something different. There's something different happening. These wicked hearts are part of the reason God will never curse the land again in the way he did with the floodwaters, rather than man's evil heart causing the floodwaters to come and for God to respond that way. So what does man's evil heart and wicked intentions have to do with the ground being cursed is a question I have. What does the wicked hearts of mankind have to do with Noah's acceptable sacrifice? So you see two dimensions to God's motivation for making this statement in his heart. So you go, God, if you were to say, God, why did you decide this? Why did you say this in your heart? He would point to the fragrant offering of Noah and his righteousness. And then at the same time, with the other hand, he'd point to the wickedness of mankind's heart being evil from his youth. So and on one hand, he goes, because of his righteous act. And on the other hand, because of mankind's wickedness. And there's this dual dimension. God holds both in both of his hands. So just something to pay attention to. It seems as though Noah's sacrifice in the new world is being contrasted with the wickedness of mankind in the old world. I see that contrast pretty clearly. Real quick, if you don't know me, my name is Jason, and I have some free gifts for you at abovereproachministry.com. Go to the website or click the links in the description below to check out all of our free Bible study resources. We have online Bible classes, devotional studies, Bible study workshops, all of my sermon notes, and more. You can even join our online church community on the Discord app. We also have discussion groups all around the world, and if you don't see one in your area, message me and we'll help you start a launch group. I personally lead a group in Spartanburg, South Carolina. If you live in the area, we'd love to have you join us on Fridays for Bible study. So contact me if you're interested, and if you or your church would like me to come preach or teach, just message me or shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do, because I love preaching in person. If you're a new follower of Jesus, click the New Believers section to access everything we recommend for new believers. And be sure to snag a copy of my book, Fruitful, to support this ministry. All right, that's all I got for you. Let's jump back into the video. The heart here being referred to as evil from its youth. That's actually going to be a problem that God progressively deals with throughout human history. Jeremiah will speak of the hearts being wicked, and he and Ezekiel will speak of how humanity needs a new heart that only God can give. And so the wicked hearts of mankind will be a huge theme and a huge problem continually throughout the rest of Scripture and even human history. And so the hearts of mankind are evil from its youth, his youth, her youth, but it doesn't say they're evil from the womb. I want us to pay attention to that, depending on how you interpret the Hebrew variation of this word transliterated in the English. I don't know how far that goes. I haven't studied that. But I will say this, A lot of people assume they build this theology off of this one statement that mankind is evil from the womb. And they'll point to David talking about conceived in iniquity, that idea, as if they're born evil. And all I'm trying to point out is that Scripture says, no, God says the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth. What qualifies as youth? Where do we draw the line? At what point does youthfulness essentially begin? Where is that? What is that age range? And where does that begin? Am I drawing an unnecessary distinction by saying God doesn't say evil from the womb, he says evil from his youth? Is that a distinction we're supposed to see, or is that something that I am conjuring up on my own? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts. Also, notice how God's heart here, is contrasted once again with man's heart here in the same verse. We saw that in Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 and 6. It says that God saw the hearts of man were evil continually, and then God is grieved in his heart. And here we see that God says in his heart that he will not destroy all life or curse the ground the way he did with the flood because of mankind's heart being wicked. So the story has progressed to the point that we now have a new understanding and almost a new perspective on how God is going to relate to human evil. God's not going to tolerate it. God's not going to ignore it. God's not going to excuse it. But God is not going to deal with it on the level that he did, in the way that he did in the days of Noah, whatever that entails. So it was appropriate for the season of human history that they were in, and it was the right decision. But God knows that the way he brought the flood and the way he removed life from the land is not going to be the best decision moving forward in the new era of human history, the new season of human history that Noah and mankind will find themselves in. It won't be fitting for any point in the future. God has purposed and promised in his heart to work with mankind. Even though there will be judgment and consequences, and even the ground will be cursed at times in different ways, it won't be like the flood. In whatever way that specifically works itself out. So we have to ask, in what ways will future judgments not be like the flood? In what ways will God's dealing with humanity be different from the flood from here on out? Then we get to verse 22, while the earth remains. We got seed time and we got harvest. We got cold, we got heat. We got summer, we got winter. We got day, we got night. These shall not cease. This verse, as we wrap up our session in Genesis 8, this verse in particular seems to tell us what was unique about the flood judgment versus the ways God will interact with mankind in the future and bring judgment in the future. The way the flood is unique is that God strikes down every living creature and curses the ground because of mankind, and specifically that involves seed time, harvest, stopping, cold and heat, stopping, summer and winter, stopping, day and night, stopping. And that seems to be the inference here in verse 22, is that the flood interrupted the natural order of the land and the normal progression of seasons. And what's interesting is the next time we're going to see that clearly is going to be with the plagues that come on Egypt. Just with each plague, a different aspect of the human experience will be messed with. A different aspect of the natural order of God's world will be messed with because of man's evil, Pharaoh and Egypt's evil. So the flood is to be viewed as having interrupted the natural order of the land and progression of seasons. Even daytime seems to have been halted in a similar way to what we see Joshua do when he prays for the sun to stand still. So the land did not experience, during the time of the flood, the land did not experience the natural rhythm and progression and pattern of the seasons, which we saw established in Genesis 1 and 2. That natural order seems to have been halted during the time the floodwaters were on the earth, because the flood interrupts it and brings it to a halt for an entire year. The waters that are not the flood waters being released, that only happened for 40 days. but the actual waters being on the earth and the way that worked itself on the land, rather, the way that worked itself out seems to involve halting the natural order and seasons for a time. Wherever the flood waters reached, the seasons and the day-night rhythm seems to not be present the way that originally it was. So I think we're to pay attention that is part of what it means that God will not do at any point in the future what he did through the flood. So that will conclude our study on Genesis chapter 8. We will pick it up in Genesis 9 whenever we do. So let me know your thoughts and comments and questions and insights in the comments section. I'd love to hear those. Be kind and respectful, and I'll see you guys in the next Bible study walkthrough. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to share your thoughts and your insights in the comments. If you want to share your thoughts and questions about these studies, join us every Thursday evening at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for a live discussion together. And thank you for supporting this ministry. Your support helps us accomplish our mission, which is to teach people how to read the Bible so they can live and teach it for themselves. We're only able to make all of these free resources because of generous supporters like you. So thank you very much for all of your support. Make sure to visit abovereproachministry.com to check out all of our free resources. And as always, keep moving towards Jesus.